Ladies and gentlemen, Shubhigi Rao.
Thank you. Every library is unlimited in that the movement of information between texts, in books and in our heads, is triggered with every encounter. This infinite textual sea may perhaps be best appreciated in the online encounters of rapidly and incessantly moving information and meaning. It is here or there that we find or lose meaning, non-meaning, preserve, erase, clarify, distract, liberate, control, and or render, randomize information junk as patterns, networks, and symbolic meaning generation. This wonder, madness, can perhaps be glimpsed in Wikipedia. For instance, more than an archive or repository, it is the perfect, perpetually incomplete encyclopedia. By its very constant state of flux, it is also the anti-encyclopedia. It grows at 10 edits per second, and thus it constantly whittles away as it propagates. Every library is open, every library is air. The air is where our young find self-determinism and freedom, which is why Edward Snowden found his intellectual and moral self in online gaming, and therefore became the champion of it. It is also where we can be as easily rendered unfree. There is a reason that the only safe transaction of information can happen in the gaps. The printed page, the codex, the samizdat. These remain the most effective air gaps as they have been throughout history. In a post-Snowden and WikiLeaks world, the book quietly holds its own, and it holds in secret its conversation with the reader. The problem is, open access is the clarion call of every library that can afford it. And as they rush to digitize, we find that the physical collection is vanishing. The book, digitized, is only information. Closed, it is an artifact, a historical and personal document, a hushed tomb, yes, but one of breathless promise that comes alive when it is opened. Open and online, it is worthless. To scan a book effectively, you must slice its spine, break its back, unpick its binding, unmake it into separate palpable sheets, flatten its text into a poor image, a pale shadow. The library is also useful. Fictive does not mean functional. The ideal library is alive, universal, default. It contains multiple languages, true and false, often unverifiable, all sources listed, even dead endings, slipping between fair use and commons, academic and non, denying and welcoming. All encyclopedia, even Wikipedia, is fictive, functional, and useful. It is the first entry on a Google search page. Why? Because it beckons us into the blue of link and cross-reference. What could be easier? And yes, as mass literacy becomes the norm rather than the exception, as we talk about online access as a human right, we know less and are less likely to look for what we don't know. We fashion echo chambers, hermetic little comfort rooms, rarely venturing beyond a soft swaddling buffer of white noise. Algorithms help us narrow our news feeds. We only need to read so much and no further. Fictive, functional, and futile. This is the online library. What I'm speaking about really are the three creation myths or origin stories of our civilization, on which civilizations are based, especially our current one. The first is the archive or library. In other words, the repository of all grand human endeavor, all knowledge shared and accessible apparently. The second, of course, is the internet. And the third is the myth of language purity. I've done one. I'm moving on to the next. Vint Cerf talks about the digital dark age. We all must have heard, I'm sure you've all heard this. But it goes beyond simply link rot and content drift. In 2018, 70% of the URLs in Harvard Law School were dead ends. 50% of the URLs within the United States Supreme Court opinions do not link to originally cited information. Almost all our information online leads nowhere. And if you think that's all, what, according to me at least, and for some of us, an act more heinous than the burning or the destruction of the Library of Alexandria, the fabled story that everyone brings up, is the destruction of a library called library.nu, NU. Library Nu was an online library of 400,000 to over 1 million articles, PDFs, textbooks, technical manuals, treatises on humanities, engineering, medicine, mathematics, biology, social sciences, treatises both obscure and groundbreaking. Available too were impossible to find out-of-print books, old and rare manuscripts. They were often works, even poor, shoddy scans of copyrighted material in multiple languages. This repository offered specialist and obscure knowledge to students and poorly paid researchers from all over the world who could not afford the paywalls of publishers like Elsevier and Springer. All it took was one court injunction in Germany, and the library was shut down. It disappeared without a whimper. Most people didn't know it had gone, but that was one of the biggest losses we suffered. When the editors of The Guardian were forced to smash Edward Snowden's laptops with drills and angle grinders, it was a futile, because everything was already stored offshore, but symbolically charged act. And they did so under the orders of David Cameron, the Prime Minister of a secular democratic country. The latter speeches, David Cameron's speeches, praising the internet were amongst a decade's worth of archived Conservative Party speeches deleted en masse in May 2014. Access to it in the Internet Archive crawler robot Wayback Machine was also successfully blocked. So much for the Internet Archive. Mark Ballard, who broke the story at Computer Weekly, said that it shows how fragile the historic record is on the internet. You can, however, still access the archives, but you will have to visit the physical premises of the British Library and use their terminals, where they have been archived as legal deposit. Interestingly, by the way, these speeches also include a fair number of Tory speeches about the importance of online access, open access and online use as freedom right, human right. It may seem, therefore, that the redundant physical library has yet to outlive its usefulness. Redundancy is, when you think about it, the best backup of all. The third origin story or creation myth or final fiction that I'm going to speak about is one of language. I am composed of multiple races and communities because all my ancestors shamelessly married for love. And so I do not belong to single community, caste, religion, or linguistic group. So although I have the Indian accent, you can't really tell where it's from. Because I moved around a lot, I grew up near the Tibetan border, I learned Nepali and Tibetan, learned Bengali, moved elsewhere, closer to the Northwest frontier, learned Urdu, forgot that. I have learned and forgotten so many languages that I actually don't have time for it today. The only language I know with any degree of fluency is English, and I call it the poverty of my singular language. Kidlat actually mentioned this and spoke about it at quite length, about the cocoon of colonial sort of hegemony. I don't remember the exact phrase. For me, it's similar, except that I can never break out of my cocoon. Every language is an accumulation of generations of lived experience, belief systems, knowledge structures, pain, misery, triumph, and progress. Every language ever spoken by our species is a cognitive tool with its own arrangement structures and is an essential survival tool for our species. Recorded in every language are that group's responses and elucidations to the problems that are peculiar to it. And that's really important. From the environmental to the philosophical. How we learn a language and our facility with it influences the way we think, what we think, and why. Embedded in language, too, are the biases and truncations that are archetypical to the lived experience of that language community. But half the world's 7,000 languages are set to disappear by the next century. There's one language lost every 14 days. As each language leaves, it takes with it all the accumulated knowledge, ways of thinking, culture and philosophy, strategies and technical expertise of generations of humans, and we are incalculably impoverished as a species. The loss of a language involves the loss of identity, of course, of the community and of the individual. Languages, as Carlos Fuentes pronounced, can only live like bread and love by being shared with others. In the natural world, pushed to the margins as it is by exploding human populations and habitat destruction, this has been devastating. As territories fracture and become isolated pockets, animals cannot communicate. They cannot breed with a larger gene pool. They cannot make new tribes or offshoots or establish new niches. The language of birds is drowned out by the noise from highways and human structures, resulting in lower body condition and weight, since the noise affects efficiency, duration, audibility, and transmission of calls. Birds have to spend more time monitoring the skies and the airwaves. They are unable to bulk up now for the winter. Species never heard, chronicled, recorded, or observed by us are vanishing as a consequence of our choices and actions, especially in the Amazon, and especially under the current demagogue that holds sway over it. Along with the flora and fauna of the Amazon, entire communities of people continue to face extinction. The Amazonian piranhas and banavas is poignant in its chronicling of vanishing tongues. As of 2012, there were only 5 native speakers of Orowen left. All of them are over 50 years of age. They are now unable to recall their history, their knowledge, their law, relying more on Portuguese. Unable to speak with fluency in either language, the wealth of Orowen history, philosophy, literature, and scientific wisdom is, for all practical purposes, already extinct. With it gone are the structures and epistemologies of that language. The obliteration of a people is complete when their language vanishes. Language loss is most traumatic to those who are aware of its vanishing. The 400 remaining Jarawa of the Andaman Islands call themselves Aong or people, but to their traditional enemies, Jarawa means foreigner, and that is how we know them. The Amazonian Suravahas have a rich and remarkable comprehension of their environment and extensive botanical knowledge. Their language holds within it a wealth of information about local flora, fauna, and human interactions with it. Their knowledge also includes their ability to extract venom for their arrows and blowguns. After first contact with the outside world in the form of rubber tappers and missionaries, it resulted in their near extinction from influenza. Suravaha withdrew deeper into their territories. As pressure on land increases from state and corporate interests, Suravaha are unable to resist being overwhelmed by the modern world. They have begun committing suicide by drinking their own curare. In 1 year alone, 8 adults and teenagers killed themselves in a single day. For a population of only 157, this is devastating. From a resilient community with centuries of history, the Surava are now all too aware of their fragility and smallness as a people. Their language, culture, and values cannot compete with those from outside. It is as though they take the death of their language to be the death of their people. Where does that leave us? Well, I don't have any solutions, but I do have a proposition, and it's one I think that also has been mentioned in the morning session. And this is something that I think as artists it is possible to consider. Storytelling is a form of resistance. It's one way in which we repopulate depleted or impoverished archives. It's one way to re-examine the creation myths, as I call them. And the reason I call them myths is because they are composed of much falsehood, and perhaps we may be able to glean some truths. What can we glean? That archives and libraries do not hold most of the stories of the displaced, marginalized, or indigenous. So we often have to default to reading so-called primary source texts written about them, often by colonizers. Can oral histories create alternative archives? Is it possible to build them without contamination? Is it possible, even desirable, to build them in isolation? Histories and narratives are not all that is missing. Absent too are ways of speaking and thinking, the forms of construction used to recreate experiences and ideas. Literary continuity generates an ever-evolving database of vocabularies, patois, and propensities that can be foundational. But we do not have the vocabularies anymore. We need to color in what is missing, and we need the tools with which to unlock and make them ours. Libraries still hold that potential even when schools no longer do. So it isn't enough to just defend the public library, critical though that is still. We must add to it, populate it with forms, genres, and literary experiments that are dissimilar, because there is no singular language, there is no singular community, there is no unifying principle for any community. I'll end with a slightly personal note. I've spent the last 4 years now in the midst of a 10-year project that's dealing with vanishing languages, destruction of books and libraries, the power of shadow libraries, illegal pirate libraries, and so on. And I realized that because the project meant I had to work in isolation, I was thinking about community but not being of that commons. What have I found through listening, recording, and reading? Through the last years of enforced solitude, domestic chaos, fright and loneliness, serendipities and reunions, friendships gained and lost. For one, the discovery that writing is not a solitary process. We are all carriers of the ideas and words of other people. We may write alone, but in the right act of writing, we listen and we amplify the voices of others. We may not recognize this form of sociability enough, but this is why writing, translating, publishing, reading, and storytelling are the connective tissue of our species. When we write, we are collective. Thank you.